Borders with Pedro Rios. I will be hosting and your MC for tonight. First, I will orient you to some of the tech aspects of tonight. Then I'll say a little bit more about Pedro, and we'll enter together into some silent worship, and he'll deliver his message out of the silence. Then we'll open the question and answer session, and that will be the evening. So I'm sure a lot of you, most of you, are very familiar with Zoom at this point, but we will be live streaming this video to our YouTube channel, Pendle Hill USA, and it'll be there, recorded there for later viewing as well. The only folks who will be recorded are myself and Pedro. Your faces as participants will not show up on the YouTube video. I've enabled live transcription, so you are able to access closed captioning. If you go down to the bottom bar of your Zoom, you'll be able to turn on closed captions. For the chat, we've disabled the public chat function, so participants are really able to focus on hearing the message. You're able to chat with me if you have technical issues of any sort. And that chat box is also down at the bottom of your screen. During the question and answer session at the end, you can send your questions to me via direct chat, and I will read them aloud to Pedro. This allows us to sort of consolidate and synthesize similar questions so that the Q&A can go a bit more smoothly. You can also send me your questions during the lecture or wait until the session itself. So with tech out of the way, welcome to the experiment that is Pendle Hill. Pendle Hill is a 91-year-old experiment in faith, intentional community, learning community, and the intersections of all of those three. We're really excited because this lecture celebrates our relationship with American Friends Service Committee, AFSC. Pendle Hill was established in close partnership with AFSC, and this lecture is a part of that ongoing relationship, and that's really exciting. One of Pendle Hill's ongoing questions is how are we called to prophetic witness? And I think Pedro's talk speaks to that, as does a lot of AFSC's work. So by being here tonight, you're a part of the Pendle Hill experiment, and so thank you for joining us in that. I'm really excited today to introduce Pedro Rios. He's the director of AFSC's US-Mexico Border Program and has worked with AFSC since 2003. He oversees a program that documents abuses by law enforcement agencies. He collaborates with community groups, advocates for policy change, and works with migrant communities to build collective leadership locally and throughout the border region. So I invite us all to settle into some silent and contemplative worship. Do not hesitate to message me if you have any questions throughout. And with that, let's settle into some silence. And Pedro, please speak as you are led out of the silence.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you to Pendle Hill and everyone who has been a part of Pendle Hill for so many years. It's such a pleasure to join you this evening. It's evening here in the Pacific Coast, as I'm sure in the East Coast as well. So thank you again for the invitation. So I'll introduce myself, share a little bit about the work that I do along with my colleagues in San Diego, and then into some of the conversations that I think will be interested and intrigued about, as well as pose some questions that I think might serve as queries for how we move forward in this conversation. Again, my name is Pedro Rios, and I've been with AFSC since 2003, as Anna mentioned. It's been my great pleasure to work with my colleagues in San Diego and my colleagues throughout AFSC on immigration and border issues. And I think what we bring forward as a program at AFSC is a border perspective that oftentimes gets missed in conversations around immigration reform, as well as conversations about border issues in general. So I'll try to wrap that up into my presentation today, and hopefully, if I miss anything, you have the opportunity towards the end to ask questions as well. And I should say that I'm what I bring to the table insofar as my personal connection to the borderlands is that I am from the borderlands. I grew up here in the San Diego area, as did most of my family, and as many families in the border communities. I have an immigration story, or stories rather, that connect me to really make inquiries into how we move our work forward for justice, and how we do it in a way that's bound with dignity, how we do it in a way that's bound with respecting everyone and being as welcoming as possible. And oftentimes that is in complete, how should I say, almost an affront to some of the policies that we work on in a daily basis. And I'll touch on some of those as well. So I'll begin sharing my screen and continue with the presentation in that sense. Great. So again, the title of tonight's lecture is Love Knows No Borders, and using the US-Mexico border as a case study, simply because there are borders throughout the world. And as we're seeing, there are even more borders that are cropping up in different parts of the world. And so this is a case study. It's based out of my lived experience. It's based out of the work that we do here with the American Friends Service Committee in the San Diego area. So one of the things that I want to start off with is the perception that border communities are out of control. And we've seen this perception in the news and in different aspects in terms of how it's presented to us. And so the queries that I want to put forward are related to how that perspective gets framed. And so some of the questions that I want to pose as we're moving forward with this lecture are what forces have defined this reality for us? Who gets to decide how our stories get told? And whose truth do we see reflected in the policies that most impact our lives? And so all of those three questions push me to ask myself, at what point, those of us who live in border communities, at what point do we determine for ourselves how we ensure that our dignity is respected and upheld? So one of the areas of work that we have focused on now for many years in San Diego is working directly with impacted communities, working directly with those who have seen immigration raids in their homes, those who have borne the brunt of the militarization of border communities. And when I speak of those, I also, I want to be sure that I'm speaking for myself as well, because I've seen how my community has been militarized for so many years, and the transformation that has left an imprint in the lives that many of us have here in the borderlands. And so, for instance, when I was a child, I remember that as other children played tag, we used to play a game called La Migra, which was very similar to tag. So La Migra is a colloquial way of saying immigration or immigration enforcement agents. And so that was the tag that we played in my neighborhood, very close to the border. I grew up 5 minutes from the US-Mexico border. And so this reality of living in the borderlands and seeing the militarization of my community deeply impacted the how I framed my understanding of who I was as a person living in the borderlands, especially when I could cross into Tijuana, but my cousins weren't able to visit me crossing into San Diego. And so there were these disparities that became very apparent. And then as I as I became older, I learned that border crossing in some ways was reflected in different histories of my past. Specifically, for instance, I found out that my paternal grandparents were, even though they were born in the United States, became victimized by something called the Repatriation Acts of the 1930s. And even though they were US citizens, they were picked up by immigration agents then and deported to Mexico, even though they were US citizens again. And so this crossing borders back and forth has become something that I've identified as who I am as a person, as a borderlander, and as we say in Spanish, as a fronterizo. And so the impact that this has, especially in terms of how we see policies and how policies are being developed, in some cases, extremely egregious against those that don't have any status or those that are seeking refuge. And so, for instance, we see now that under the Biden administration, the same policies that former President Trump put in place continue under the Biden administration and to some extent have been expanded. And so those are questions that I think about in terms of how we define our reality, going back to the question of our reality and who defines it for us. And so for us, there's been a premise that war has been the foundation for policy making. I'm not sure what's going on here. There we go. War has been the foundation for policymaking in the United States. And so the image that you see there is an image of several hundred Customs and Border Protection agents. In the back of them, they are supported by military personnel who were running what they called an exercise. And in this exercise, they closed off the Otay Mesa border crossing, similarly as they had done with the San Isidro border crossing, to play out this scenario that what if migrants would cross into the US, attempt to cross through the ports of entry. And so this scenario of bringing out hundreds of agents played out throughout the borderlands at most of the major land ports, with this belief that they were preparing themselves in case of a large incursion of migrants, many of whom during this time would be making a claim for asylum. So this had the effect of a number of things. One is that it essentially normalized the idea that responding with violence is an acceptable and tolerable way of responding to people who are in need of safety, in need of refuge. And secondly, that it imposed what we would call collective punishment, so that everyone who is crossing through the ports would suddenly be delayed an extra 20 minutes to 45 minutes in an already extensive amount of time that they have to wait to cross. Sometimes it takes up to 4 hours, sometimes up to 5 hours to cross the ports. And so this was an exercise meant to frame an anti-immigrant narrative, particularly for those that were seeking refuge. And so we especially saw these exercises during the Trump years, but we also saw them early on during the Biden administration. And so what I'm wanting to get to, see if I can, okay, there we go, is that there's been a framing around border policies and border militarization through this idea of wars. And so in the more recent decades, beginning since the 1980s, and certainly we can go even further back than that, but the war on drugs, the war on criminals, the war on terror after 9/11, and so on and so forth, the spillover violence that we saw during the Obama years, and then the national security premise that Trump brought forward in terms of the migrant caravans that were arriving to border areas, and then much more recent, using the pandemic together with national security under the Biden administration to justify the use of these harmful policies that are placing people at greater risk. And so irrespective of who is in the White House, at least from our perspective, we have seen that there's been a culminating effect of these policies, and more, I would say, apparent with the use of Title 42. This is a CDC order that allows Border Patrol agents to expeditiously expel migrants without observing their due process rights. And so even though that was developed during the Trump years as president under the guidance of Stephen Miller, someone who's known to hold some extremist viewpoints on race and ethnicity, this policy continues today. Even though during those years, during the Trump years, President Biden was speaking out against those same policies, that not only does he continue to uphold them, but has expanded some of them as well. And so we see more people that are being harmed, people that are being expelled multiple times, and when they attempt to cross for a third time, for instance, they might face death. There was a woman who crossed twice, was expelled twice on both of those instances. She informed the Border Patrol agents that she wanted to make a claim for asylum. And on her third attempt, she drowned off the coast of San Diego. So there have been roughly around 30% of apprehensions by Border Patrol are people that have crossed multiple times. And so what we see is that these policies, especially Title 42 and a few others, not only do they not work, but they place people in greater harm. And so the effect that we have seen is that violence gets normalized. And so the juxtaposition of these two photos, one, you have Border Patrol dressed in this sort of military garb at the Friendship Park area. And on the other side, you see Border Patrol agents that are dressed as Santa Claus that are giving presents at a local community in El Paso, Texas. And so the contradictions here, I think, speak for themselves. On the one hand, this idea that Border Patrol agents are there to provide some level of security or safety to the community while engaging in these practices that are innocuous, they're harmless, they are doing something for the community. And on the other hand, the militarized presence of Border Patrol agents that are ready to fire pellets and other sorts of projectiles at people who are wanting to seek asylum. And so the normalization of violence, though, it's not something that's new to how border enforcement gets or operates. Violence being normalized was was one of the factors that was developed under the 1990s, and even before that during the 1980s, as part of the strategy that Border Patrol developed to try to deter migration into the US. And so that came to, that fully developed under what was known as prevention through deterrence by Border Patrol in the mid-90s. And the idea or the concept that was used was territorial denial. And this is all military parlance in terms of how it gets framed by Border Patrol as an agency, and also some of the larger agencies above that. So territorial denial was preventing people from actually entering into, excuse me for a second. Sorry about that. So the idea was, if you would prevent people from entering, then the problem around migration would be resolved. And so what we actually started seeing during the mid-90s is that people were being pushed to much more extreme crossing areas, including the mountains and the deserts, which led to then an increased number of people that were dying as a result of attempting to cross to dangerous terrain, and were facing harsher conditions. The normalization of violence was also something that was a part of what we saw in low intensity conflict policy, where if you normalize the violence and then you get to a point where civil society stops questioning it, and consequently the presence of armed agents who are handing out good citizenship awards at local elementary schools no longer gets questioned, as well as the actions and activities that are seemingly violent by border agents. And so this is the context that I'm providing is really the context that I grew up in as a border resident, as a fronterizo, seeing the presence of Border Patrol agents in my community in such a way where there really wasn't questioning about that violence unless someone really delved deeply into why people were being chased. And this happened pretty regularly by my grandparents' home in San Isidro, where my grandparents would hand out water and food to migrants who were making their way through their yard to be picked up and be taken somewhere else. But also having other sort of militaristic presence. So you had the helicopters that were flying pretty regularly overnight. The presence of vigilante groups was quite prominent. When I was in high school, there was a group of youth my age as well, who were engaged in hunting migrants. And so they would dress in military fatigues. They would go out to the marshlands, where Friendship Park is located, and they would go out and hunt migrants. And there was collusion between them and between some of the law enforcement agents. And along with that, you had the increase of migration through the area, through urban areas that were really facing some difficult situations and scenarios, including being run over by vehicles. And so when, as a teenager in high school, seeing this, it really, for me, framed my thinking of trying to center those questions about who gets to belong and who doesn't, and who gets to decide that. And especially with the amount of low intensity violence that I was being witness to as a youth, and not to mention a few years afterwards, again in the mid 90s, where in California was passing Proposition 187, which would have made it that every person that worked in some sort of social service industry, so teachers, law enforcement officers, medical staff, would have to report people that they suspected of being undocumented. And the language was a little bit harsher. I would say they suspected of being illegal. They were then obligated to report those individuals to the authorities. The proposition passed 51-49, but it was stopped in the courts and later considered unconstitutional. So all of this was taking place as I was growing up and really framing my mindset about why there was so much of violence and that violence targeting people who seem to not belong. So that's part of what our work has been in San Diego and elsewhere with various coalitions. The idea is to try to change the narrative on militarism and counter the narrative, one that centers human rights, one that centers, again, the idea that we all deserve to be treated with dignity and with respect. And the case, or what I'm highlighting here in this photo, was the case of Anastasio Hernandez Rojas, who was a 26-year resident of San Diego. He was undocumented. He had 5 children, and he was beaten and tasered and tortured to death by over a dozen agents. That included Border Patrol, that included ICE agents, that included Customs and Border Protection agents. And this happened in May of 2010. So since Anastasio's brutal killing, we have been able to document numerous other cases, over 150 cases of people that have died tragically and violently because of violence by Border Patrol agents and by other CBP personnel. And so the challenge for us has been, how do we counter the narrative that militarism is an appropriate response to migration when the increase of militarism is leading to increased violence and increased situations where people are losing their lives or are being injured in so tragic incidents. So what we go back to here. I want to stick to this here as well. So what we have seen then is that as what we've discovered collectively among some of the organizations that have been working on this is that there is a lot that we can say about the design of the enforcement apparatus in border communities. One example of that is that the Border Patrol operates secret units since 1987 that were purposely created to mitigate civil liability for the agency. And we discovered this, and I'm talking about the collective organizations that work on border issues. We discovered this through the investigation surrounding Anastasio's death. So for instance, Border Patrol agents, when they beat Anastasio, when they tasered him, and when they tortured him, they indicated in the report that he became combative, that he was struck once, fell back and struck his head, and at that point was taken to the hospital in a situation very close to like being brain dead. It wasn't until a witness came forward months later where she provided footage of the actual incident. What we also discovered was that the Border Patrol's secret unit did not provide the San Diego Police Department with access to certain information about the incident. This included access to camera footage. It included access to the reports that Border Patrol had written about the case. They manipulated information. They weren't permitted to access some of the witnesses initially, and they were present during the entire investigative process, to the extent that there's some belief, well, not belief, we know that a high-ranking Border Patrol agent illegally used an immigration warrant to access Anastasio's medical records in order to then filter certain information to the media to suggest that Anastasio was under the influence of a narcotic, which then justified this violence against him. Once that information was out to the media ran with it, and the conclusion was, well, he probably was deserving of the beating because he was being combative against the Border Patrol agents. And look, there's the information. The blood draw shows that, in fact, there was narcotics in his system. However, there was questions about how that blood draw happened because it did not follow the proper procedures, and it suddenly there was no information about how that blood draw or information about it was included in the report, when the very first blood draw that was taken showed that, in fact, Anastasio did not have narcotics in his system. And so all this led us to explore other cases along the border. And so what we began to discover was that the secret Border Patrol unit was in fact involved in mitigating not only civil liability for the agency and for the agents themselves, but also criminal liability. So when the Department of Justice met with Anastasio's family in 2015, they said, we don't have enough evidence to hold the agents accountable for the actions that they did, even though we had provided, and actually the woman that you see in the photo, Anastasia's mom, Doña Luz, took the video footage and delivered it to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. During the time when Customs and Border Protection was, and the Department of Justice was conducting an investigation on the case. So it was this petite woman from San Luis Potosí in Mexico, delivered this information, vital information, and even with that information, they would not hold the agents accountable. And so at that point, what I concluded was this wasn't a case of rotten apples, as oftentimes law enforcement agents like to say, but that the entire system was really rotten when you have an agency that, without a congressional mandate, provides certain agents the power and the authority to investigate for the purposes of mitigating civil and criminal liability, then something is really off, something is really wrong. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there were numerous cases where these secret units started appearing. There was a case out of Arizona, for instance, where a teenager was shot multiple times by a Border Patrol agent through the border wall. And the Border Patrol agent claimed that the kid, I think he was 15, threw rocks at the Border Patrol agent. And so he was compelled to fire at him because he feared for his life. The child died. I believe I think he was shot 9 times. The 9 shots, the impacts were through the back. This kid had been playing basketball. He arrived home and was told by his mom, I believe, to go to the store and pick up some groceries. And so he ended up dying as a result of being shot 9 times by an agent. And so the investigation then, again, by one of these secret Border Patrol units, they arrived at the scene and claimed to have picked up the rocks, but there was never any real evidence taken. The site was corrupted by the agents who were running back and forth in the area, even while the investigation was taking place. And so there are many examples of this. There was an example just last year, during the summer of last year, where a Border Patrol agent fired on a woman, shot her in the head. Fortunately, she survived. The Border Patrol agents arrived at the scene. They essentially relegated the police department that was in charge to do perimeter control. And it was this secret Border Patrol unit that arrived to pick up the evidence, to investigate, did not provide information to the police department. And in fact, the woman was deported without ever having been asked about the incident herself. And now she has a lawsuit against the Border Patrol for the incident that left her now with fragments of the bullet in her head. And so, these cases go, they continue to show up, and through the advocacy that we've done, specifically with the Southern Border Communities Coalition, we've been able to raise the profile that this is not only an injustice, but it's also unlawful in terms of how how it takes place, and it's something that I think really should be challenged. And so we're moving with our representatives throughout the country to really draw greater attention to this. So I want to move on into what our work looks like. We do a lot of information sharing. And so, and this is again framed around how do we change the narrative? One of the ways is to provide know your rights information to community members. And so oftentimes people don't know what their rights are. And so we offer an extensive training with the belief that if someone is trained with very basic information, that they then will train other individuals and other family members and co-workers about what that information might be. And so that question around access of information becomes really crucial. especially when there seems to be a cacophony of conversations taking place, misinformation, or incomplete information about what people's rights might be. And so in this photo, what you're seeing is a gathering at a school where a former colleague actually is presenting on what people's rights are. Oftentimes, what happens when someone is being apprehended. But oftentimes let me complete that. What happens when someone is being apprehended by ICE or by Border Patrol? But oftentimes we do a lot of a process of consultation. So in this particular photo, the colleague is presenting information about legislative proposals in Congress, because what we think is important is that how we present what we choose to support or not support should be based on conversations and a process of consultation with community members for whom that piece of legislation might impact them most. And so that's what's taking place here. There's also community organizing that takes place. And in this particular image, we support community organizations that are involved in documenting the presence of either Border Patrol or ICE in their communities. So this is an organization that has a long history in San Diego called Unión del Barrio, and they have organized community patrols where the purpose is to document the presence of ICE and Border Patrol and to provide information to community members and to try to bear witness to how devastating these ICE and Border Patrol presence can be in mostly working class communities. And they tend to be working class communities that are either Mexican, primarily Mexican, but also could be people from other Latin American communities or countries. And so the idea is having the presence of these community patrols also reverts the power dynamic. And so it's also about challenging state power by suggesting that those who would normally be targeted by ICE or by Border Patrol now take it upon themselves to say, hey, we have the power in numbers. If we organize, we're able to challenge that power and not be afraid, and no longer be afraid of how these operations take place. And so if someone is confronted by an ICE agent or by a Border Patrol agent, that they have information about what their rights are and could make a much more informed decision about what information they share with those federal agents. And that information could block a deportation or block them from being apprehended. And so we've seen this play out on many occasions with a lot of success. And I think that it's that success that we like to move forward, because if we're only, as a human rights advocate that I am, if I'm the only one sharing information, then it doesn't really make sense if no one else has access to that information. So the premise here is, how do we generalize a consciousness around human rights, that we're deserving of human rights, and how do we defend those human rights? And that defending them begins by the process of providing information, so that people are able to make decisions that don't compromise themselves and that don't compromise their loved ones. And sometimes that could be as simple as, an ICE agent coming to your home at 5 a.m. and the person saying, I'm not going to open the door, and sticking to that. And when they don't open the door, then the ICE agent might leave, but at least they were able to prevent themselves from being detained or apprehended, or a family member from being detained and apprehended. And so it's a basic information, I think, that is very useful to community members who might not otherwise have access to that information. The community organizing model that we use also is based on this idea of sharing information. And so here you have an image of a community member in Eastern San Diego County who went through an extensive 20-hour course that we offer in our program. And the idea is to explore certain questions. One of them, the very first one is, who am I? And within that question, we ask, how do we get here? What is your migration story? And everyone has a migration story. And so from that, we begin to tease out where our similarities are, where our, what we have in common. And it's through those commonalities then that we build relationships with each other. And we build, they're not shallow relationships, but they're deeply held relationships, because the migration stories oftentimes are very emotional. They are very painful. We talk about what happened to people to make that extremely difficult but dignified choice of saying, I need to migrate for X, Y, and Z, whether it's because I am facing violence, whether I'm hungry or my family is going hungry, or more recently because of climate change. And so having, for instance, the opportunity to bring people together and for them to feel that they're not alone, that the experience that they live through is an experience that they can find commonalities with other individuals in their community. And then it's through those commonalities that they organize themselves. And through that organizing, then we also explore, well, how do civil rights apply to me as someone who is undocumented, or someone who might be a legal permanent resident, or someone who has DACA, or someone who's a US citizen, but parents are undocumented. So how do civil rights and how does the US Constitution protect me? So they explore that in a very deep way. And oftentimes what they find is that some of their basic human needs aren't being met, that the US Constitution doesn't meet those needs. So the right to housing, the right to having nutritious food, for instance, the right to work. And so then they go into another level of exploring what the UN Declaration for Human Rights means for them. And so they explore that in a deeper level. And oftentimes what they conclude is, this is a great document, we can use this as a tool, but maybe it doesn't define us, those of us that appear to be stateless, those of us where we're living in the United States, but the United States where we work and we pay taxes and we provide all sorts of cultural attributes to the United States, but yet we don't have the right to vote, or we don't have the right to certain benefits, and so on and so forth. And so they're almost rendered stateless. So while the UN Declaration for Human Rights is an important document and they use it as a tool, there are some gaps around there. So then they look into, well, what does community organizing mean? If we're able to organize a birthday party or a wedding or what have you, then we take those and we demystify community organizing, and we substitute, instead of organizing a birthday party, maybe we might organize a campaign to support greater accountability for a police officer who seems to be targeting our particular street. And so then that's how they demystify some of the social issues, and they then start providing answers for themselves. And some of that then means that people will then take on the challenge of legislative advocacy, going to DC or going to, in our case, Sacramento, to push for policies that are favorable not only for them but also for their own communities as well. And so that's something that I think has been extremely helpful to see, that it's not me as an AFSC staff member who is speaking on their behalf, but where they then can speak on their own behalf about the most pressing needs that they have identified for themselves in their community. And then we have other aspects that I think are also important to mention. How cultural resistance looks like. Initially the idea was to share actions that are nonviolent, and these actions are nonviolent. I mean, you see musicians that are gathered on both sides of the border wall who are doing something that is an everyday thing, right? They're playing music. But the fact that they're playing music in front of the border wall is dividing the musicians. On one side, you have Mexican players. On this side, you also have Mexican players and US players who are gathered together. Oftentimes, the songs that they're singing our playful songs that speak about social issues. And so gathering hundreds of musicians together. This is an event that has taken place now for over 10 years. Unfortunately, Border Patrol has not permitted access to this area over the past 2 years, so the event has not been held. There are also, one of the events that we're involved in is the Border Posada, which is, in English, we say the Posada without borders, la Posada sin fronteras. And this Posada takes place in a very similar place as the other image. And the idea is looking at the nativity story through a migration lens, because ultimately that's what it was. And so bringing hundreds of people together, again, to celebrate the nativity story, but put it into its proper political context of what migration tells us today. And so we provide a space where migrants on the US side and on the Mexican side share their stories and really bring to life the nativity story that might, I don't know, some people might see it as archaic, but then we see it in real life here. Specifically how migrants are not being permitted to make a claim for asylum. So essentially they're being, they wouldn't even have made it to the manger in this case. And so there's a lot of readings that we take from the nativity story to the political context of today. And so every year that we've done this, it's appropriate because we have people that are dying in the desert, people that are living very dangerous circumstances and trying to make a claim for asylum, and now they're not allowed to do so. Other events are marches where people participate politically, in this case, dancing in front of the federal building as a way to speak out against border abuses. And this was during a May Day event, so connecting it to larger events taking place globally. So again, reframing the story of May Day from the perspective of migration in this case, and very specifically tied to migrants that are barely making ends meet. So working class perspective in terms of how these policies impact certain groups of people. And then there are other events. This is an event called it's a border run that takes place right along the border. It's a 5K. And the idea here is to bring people together in the form of a spiritual run. So it's not a race in the typical sense that a 5K might be. It's more of bringing people together to experience an athletic event through a spiritual collective process of healing. So running together during this 5K along the border and then returning to the place. And most cases when this event has been organized, it's led by staff. These are staffs that are come from many different indigenous communities throughout the Americas. And it's again, it's very ceremonial in terms of how it's done. And I should say that for many years, the Border Patrol used to also organize a 5K along this area, where they would have booths set up. And in one of the booths, it included children that were told to hold these pellet guns and fire at a metal cutout of a person dressed in rags, with the background being the border wall. And so we challenged that and said, you're essentially teaching children that it's okay to fire upon migrants. And eventually they did away with that because there was a lot of public pressure that came out about just people not being okay with that. And again, going back to how violence gets normalized, where it's okay to teach children to fire at someone dressed presumably as a migrant with the border wall behind them. The Border Patrol said, no, that's not supposed to be a migrant, but we know that their function is to detain people who are crossing the border. And for what other purpose would they have this metal cutout? And so that has been probably about 6 or 7 years that they haven't organized a 5K. And I'm glad to say that in place of that, this act of spiritual resistance. It's this 5K that is called the Breakdown Borders Run, because the idea is to break down borders so that we're able to more fundamentally develop deeper relationships as human beings. Again, another spiritual prayer. We had a lot of elders that came to San Diego in 2018 and led a series of spiritual events to call attention to, in that case, especially the children that were being separated from their family members. So it was an opportunity to bring people from outside of the border area to San Diego and to really draw attention to what we consider to be a complete travesty that policy was being put in place. And it was a time where Jeff Sessions, former senator, former attorney general, came to San Diego to announce that policy that would separate several thousand children from their family members. And so this spiritual prayer was an attempt to acknowledge the wrongs that were taking place and to try to address them in a spiritual way. And so that brings me then to the title of this lecture, the Love Knows No Borders, and which I'd like to share a little bit more about and just do a quick check on time. I think I have maybe like 20 minutes or so. I think that's correct. Okay, great. So I don't know if any of you participated in the Love Knows No Borders event. The basic idea behind this was that we wanted to bring members representing faith communities and their members, their congregants, to the border to restore peace and dignity and justice at the border with a water ceremony that was supposed to take place right at where the border wall is. And so we put a call out to faith communities all over the United States, and their response was amazing. And so our colleagues in San Diego, together with our colleagues nationally and from different parts of the AFSC organization, joined us to organize this large-scale event where over 400 people actually showed up. And there were a couple of ideas behind this. One was that we truly did want to restore peace and with dignity and justice at the border. So this was in December of 2018. This happened on Human Rights Day on December 10th, 2018. The idea was, how do we do that? If we bring members of various faith communities out and they representing all of their congregations, then that's how we do it. That's how we ensure that we show that the many different faith traditions were standing together to say it is not okay to separate children from their families. It is not okay to not permit people to seek asylum. It's not okay to use violence in preventing people from seeking asylum, and so on and so forth. We understood the parameters of what was taking place then. At that time, the Border Patrol had prevented us from doing the Posadas sin Fronteras. They were also taking much more extreme measures, having agents with long arms, other weapons. There had been 2 incidents at that point already where border agents had fired chemical agents at migrants who were approaching the border wall, very violently had done so. And so we as the American Friends Service Committee thought that it was our purpose to bring people together to show that really it was love that was driving us to suggest a different tone for what was taking place in our communities. So we made the call, and as I mentioned, over 400 people arrived and joined us, and we wanted to conduct this water ceremony. So as we were walking approximately 1.5 miles from where the staging area is, where the border wall is, we were met with dozens of armed agents, Border Patrol agents, many of whom all of them were armed. Some of them had different sorts of weaponry on them. They would not allow us to walk towards the border wall to conduct the water ceremony. And unfortunately, that meant that some of our participants were arrested. Around 31 or 32 of our participants were arrested. And I think we challenged the narrative in different ways. One was that all of these people that participated, when they returned to their congregations, they were not only were they sharing the experience that they had had, a very moving prophetic experience of challenging the state apparatus that was denying children the ability to be with their families, that was seeing children dying under custody of Border Patrol. But they also took our messages back to their congregations, something that we had hoped would have been an important component of concluding this. So if the imagery around this was not enough, it was actually, I think, for me, the biggest goal was that people actually returned to their congregations and were sharing our messages about the need to demilitarize border communities, the need to support families that were seeking safety and shelter, the need to ensure that we don't use violence as a way to prevent people from seeking refuge. And so these are some of the images, and you see how Border Patrol agents were detaining some of our participants in some cases violent way. One of our my supervisor, in fact, was specifically targeted because he was identified as one of the leaders. So he was pulled out violently and thrown on the ground and held incommunicado for about 24 hours or so. The chief of the Border Patrol at the time would not share information about where he was. They wouldn't allow him to make phone calls. They kept his personal property, which is unfortunately standard procedure with Border Patrol agents. And so a lot of people who are apprehended, migrants who come with some money, that money is not returned to them, or phone numbers that they need in order to call their family members aren't returned to them. So they are lost in some cases. And so this was the prophetic event that really shaped for us how we were going to move forward, non-violently, but really drawing and calling attention to the power dynamics that were at play. And I think in spite of the fact that we weren't able to conduct the water ceremony right at the border wall, the border fence, we were able to draw attention to how incorrect, how immoral these decisions of separating families, especially the children, of turning people away, of using violence, of being of not tolerating the basic premise that people deserve shelter and refuge, that these were the policies in place. Let's see. I'm missing a slide. Let's see. Okay. So I want to stop there, but before I conclude, I want to go back to the very first, one of the first slides. Well, I'll remind you, I'm not going to go back to it, but where I mentioned the normalization of violence. And one of the, we use an African proverb in our human rights trainings that goes something like this: until the lions have their own historians, the stories of the greatest hunts will always glorify the hunter. And so from the perspective of the work that we do in San Diego, and I can definitely say colleagues from around the country within AFC and the programs that they operate, the belief here is to provide the tools, provide the mechanisms for people to speak for themselves, for people to share their own reality, for people to describe their own truths about their lived experience. And that really can only happen if those individuals are directly involved in every aspect of how policy gets created, of how society gets organized, and of what their wishes and their dreams and what their desires are, and how they can be then move forward so that everyone learns from them as well. And I think in the case of the work that we do with the American Friends Service Committee, it's an attempt to do that. And I feel confident saying that my colleagues and programs from around the country are involved in doing some aspect of that in the work, and in terms of how they work with directly impacted folks, and how their experiences then shape AFSC's work towards justice and towards immigration policy reform, but also towards border policies more specifically, which is the lens that I present this lecture to you. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions that you might have for me. And I again want to thank Pendle Hill and everyone involved in bringing this lecture forward.
Thank you so much. I've gotten some questions that have come in over the course of the lecture, but I just want to remind folks that to submit a question, head to your chat box and change the recipient to me, Anna Hill, and I will synthesize and read aloud. So I'm going to wait a few moments for some to come in, and then we'll begin. So in wondering about the different ways you've talked about changing the narrative in terms of access to information and community organizing and cultural resistance, I'm wondering how the pandemic has changed or shifted the ways that communities are able to organize and the ways in which they've found themselves able to do that. Or not. I know you spoke briefly at the beginning about how the pandemic was exacerbating certain border policies, and I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit as well.
Sure. So the pandemic definitely has impacted our ability to meet with community members. So the in-person meetings essentially stopped in terms of how we were having them with large groups. On the other hand, though, for instance, one of the examples that I provided are the community patrols. Those continue. The community members that organize them in such a way where they're not placing themselves in any sort of predicament where they are in close contact. So they're able to do those activities without endangering themselves in case someone were to be sick. Similarly, in a very creative way, there has been a lot of attention with actions that involve cars. And so the car caravans, for instance, are a newer way of displaying support or protest of any sort of activity. And one of the things that we've done more precisely tied to the pandemic is there's a detention facility in San Diego called the Otay Mesa Detention Center. And at that detention center, people that were detained, most of whom are migrants, but many who are not, were not being provided with the proper the proper face masks or hand sanitizing gels and other sort of equipment to prevent someone who was contagious with COVID from passing it to somebody else. And so as a result of that, we have been organizing with a local coalition called the Free Them All San Diego Coalition to draw attention to the concerns that we have of how migrants and others are living in this close contact situation. The first migrant that died under ICE detention because of COVID happened at this facility. And some of the things that people inside were doing were conducting hunger strikes. They were trying to make their own face covers with sleeves of their shirts. The facility is run by a private corporation, and this private corporation did not want to provide them with this medical equipment. So instead, they started firing some sort of chemical agents at them because of the resistance that they were presenting. So it's gone back and forth. That's been one way that we have shifted by focusing on some of the immediate dangers that some people are facing, in this case, at the detention center. In terms of the Title 42 is the one that I referred to earlier. That is the CDC order that provides Border Patrol with the authority to expel migrants without ensuring due process rights for them. And along with that, there was another policy that under the Trump administration went to effect called the Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP, otherwise known as Return to Mexico program. So if someone was having their asylum case processed, they would have to wait in Mexico for an undetermined amount of time before they got court dates to return to the US to attend those court dates. The problem was that many people did not have a fixed address. They were living in shelters. Some of those shelters, they could only stay there for a very brief amount of time. And then they were facing some dangerous situations where migrants become easy prey for people that are wishing to do them harm, especially migrants from African countries or from Haiti who don't easily mix in with the Mexican population. So you might have them that are much more harassed by the local municipal police, or could be subject to discrimination because of the color of their skin. And so these were all types of experiences that they were having while they were waiting in Mexico, or when they were turned away because of the Title 42 order. And so the pandemic made the situation much worse for them. What we were doing with my colleagues in Mexico, as well as other organizations, was trying to tell their stories, trying to explain to members of Congress how dangerous Title 42, the application of Title 42 and MPP were specifically to migrants who were wanting to seek asylum, but did not have the ability to do that because the ports were closed to them. And so trying to share their stories was one way of changing our work to some extent, but also continuing to uplift the conditions that people were living in Mexico.
Thank you. I'm getting a couple different questions about hope and what drives and energizes you in this work. I was struck by what you said about love is driving us in the Love Knows No Borders action. And I'm wondering how you and the folks you are working with and alongside of are able to hold that. And what else? Where do you find that, and where do you find spiritual grounding throughout that?
You know, I think it's important to acknowledge that I'm very privileged. I have U.S. citizenship status, and so whatever ailment I might have does not compare to some of the challenges that people are living through, especially if they're fleeing dangerous situations in their hometowns or home countries. And so the hope for me is when I'm able to see the hope in other people despite the challenges that they're facing. Not to get too gruesome, but I met a young man in the Chaparral encampment who still had a bullet lodged into his forearm after fleeing his hometown in Mexico, and he was there, had been there for a day. Didn't know where to go. I met another man who had fled another place in Mexico, was actually kidnapped in Tijuana, held for several days, tortured, because the drug cartel wanted him to become what they call a mule, someone that would cross narcotics from Mexico into the US in a surreptitious way, and he declined to do so. And he had visible injuries throughout all over his arms, and he did not want to go to a shelter because he feared that people would spot him and would detain him again. But then I also see people who are and I don't like to use the word resilient because I think that minimizes how people survive. But I see how people, especially mothers, are able to have their children, take their children with them, in spite of living out in the elements in a tent city, and are striving to do anything they can to get information about what their rights are, what their asylum rights are, so that they could make an asylum claim. Because they know that if they don't do it, if they don't make it out, then their children won't make it out. I've talked to a couple of mothers who have said, I had to self-separate, meaning that they sent their children on their own crossing to the US, because they knew that if the children crossed to the US under Title 42, they would not be turned back. They would not be returned to Mexico. If the mother and the children were to cross together, then the entire family would be returned to Mexico. So that extremely difficult choice of saying, I have to separate in order to save you, is something that I have never been in that situation. So I don't know if that gives me hope, but what I do know is that it tells me about someone's deep love for, in this case, their children, that they're willing to separate themselves in order to give them a better opportunity of surviving than what they might have at that moment. Now, this isn't to make it seem as though arriving at the U.S. suddenly they have everything provided to them. I don't want to suggest that that life changes completely in the U.S. for migrants. It's extremely harsh to be able to survive. It's traumatic. We've been living in the U.S. that's turned extremely intolerant of migrants, and so it's just getting from one obstacle to the next, and then facing the other ones, which might be somewhat different than what they might be living in their hometown or at the border, and now might be facing different challenges while in the U.S.
I'm getting a question that's expanding on your discussion of Title 42. Do you think the recent court decision preventing Department of Homeland Security under Title 42 from returning families to a country where they will be tortured will increase the number of families with children being allowed to cross the border? And sort of along with that, some questions around specific policy specific suggestions for legislative advocacy in that realm that you're working with, or that you support folks who are working for.
Yeah, I don't know if that recent decision will have any it won't have any effect just yet, because it'll take some time before it's implemented, if the Biden administration doesn't challenge it in the court, right? So we have maybe 5 weeks or so before it could actually be implemented. And then we had another court decision in Texas that stated that the Biden administration not removing children was actually unlawful, and that children should be removed. So I would probably see Border Patrol acting on the Texas decision to remove children first, rather than not returning families to their home countries, because of the different court systems that they're in. However, whether that might become a magnet for families, I don't think so. And the reason why I say this is because time after time, whenever there have been court decisions, and one to consider is DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Oftentimes you would hear people that were opposed to DACA suggesting that DACA was a magnet that would draw more people to come in search of benefiting from it. And that's truly not the case. We have not seen that. And in most scenarios, we rarely see people that make decisions to migrate based on policy that changes in Washington, or policy that is being suggested through court decisions. It's usually primarily people migrate because they don't have any other choices at the moment, and they are migrating out of necessity and not so much because of court decisions. Not to say that that might not happen, but for the most part, I don't believe that that will become a magnet for families to want to come across together and not to separate as we've seen in the past. And then I think your second part of the question was around policy proposals to suggest. I mean, there definitely are some. You know, I think, and so when we talk about policy proposals, the belief here is that Congress is willing to act on them. And I'm not confident that we're going to see anything coming out of Congress around immigration reform that will be favorable, especially as we get closer to the midterm elections. And so I think our window of anything that might be possible is closing. Now that doesn't mean that there might not be policy proposals that we would want to support, because the more we support them, the more they create an echo chamber for other members of Congress to want to support as well. But you know, there's the policy proposal that Congress can do, and then there's a policy stuff that the Biden administration can do. One of which being DACA. You know, it's like he can take action on DACA now. He can take action on not implementing Title 42 and MP. You know, there's policy changes that the administration can do. He can take action on holding the Border Patrol accountable for their secret investigative units that they have. And so all of this stuff could happen when Congress isn't moving forward. Then we can pressure the administration in a different way to make policy changes that could be have a greater lasting effect to people who could benefit from those, especially if they're grounded on protecting the basic human rights of people that are in danger.
There are a couple questions coming in from folks who are wondering about if you have book recommendations or media outlet recommendations for information and news that is trying to change the narrative and push back against the narratives that you were talking about. So I'm wondering if you have any news, media, or book recs for the folks attending.
Yeah, there's a very frequent, or not frequent, a very new media source. It's sort of a chronicle that is being published maybe once a week. It's coming out of Arizona and El Paso by two long-term journalists, Todd Miller and I'm forgetting the name. Melissa Del Bosque. So veteran journalists, border journalists that are putting together something called the Border Chronicle, I believe. And I think it's fresh, it's new. It presents border issues from an angle that might be much more nuanced than what the evening news might have. They will interview people that have been working in border communities for a long time and just have a really fresh perspective that I think is worth reading. The Southern Border Communities Coalition, the coalition that we're a part of, also puts out something called the Border Lens on a weekly basis, I think every other Friday now. So if you go to the Southern Border Communities Coalition, you can sign up to their newsletter. That's another good way of getting information about border issues. In terms of reading material, I think anything that, from my perspective, obviously, Todd Miller has been putting out some really interesting books and investigative pieces on surveillance on the border. So when we talk about the presence of Border Patrol agents and the footprint that border militarization has, there's another aspect to that is much less explored, which is the use of surveillance technology and how it's proliferated along border communities and how that is increasingly becoming part of the enforcement landscape across the United States, one of which I think is a slippery slope to everyone's civil liberties. And so looking at what gets publicized around border surveillance and equipment and technologies is extremely important. So those are some of the recommendations I have.
Thank you so much. I'm also going to put for folks a link to AFSC's US-Mexico border program that Pedro is the director of. I'm wondering if, for our last question, circling back to a thread of hope, there's a question that asks, in Charlottesville, they recently took down the Robert E. Lee statue, and it will be melted down, and doing a community engagement process to determine what Lee will be mutated into. Wondering what you would envision transforming the border wall into if we were able to knock it down, melt it, and turn it into something else.
That's wonderful. I think, I mean, there could be the possibility of doing all sorts of artistic pieces, one of which could be some sort of bridge that I think would be symbolic of something that would suggest being in opposition to a wall might be, a bridge. And so that's what I would want to see just as a starting point. And we might have other ideas that could be just as wonderful as that.
Well, thank you so much for your message. And thank you all for being here. I feel really honored to have listened to you tonight. And thank you everyone for your questions. You can find more about Pendle Hill programs at pendlehill.org that I'll also put in the chat. But thank you all for coming and have a great night. Thank you again, Pedro.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.